Well, good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson tonight. President Trump has been abroad for a week now, visiting a bunch of places, including Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Western Europe. It's been an eventful trip in a lot of ways.
Drive out the extremes. Drive them out of your holy land and drive them out of this earth.
And I want to tell you also how much we appreciate the reassertion of American leadership in the Middle East.
I can relate a lot to what Barron is going through because I've been in his age in my dad's first term. And,
And look how he turns out. The United States and Israel can declare with one voice that Iran must never be allowed to possess a nuclear weapon. Never, ever.
Well, it wasn't just ceremony either. In Riyadh, the president announced a $100 billion arms deal, which decisively aligned the U.S. with the Saudis in opposition to Iran, its Shia rival. In Israel, Trump pressured the Israeli prime minister to restart peace efforts with the Palestinians. In Brussels, he told NATO leaders that the time has come for them to pay more for their own defense rather than relying on U.S. taxpayers to protect them. Now, you can agree or disagree with any of these ideas, but they are departures from the norm and significant. They are news, in other words, and they ought to be covered by the news media. Have they been? Well, take a look at some of the top headlines from this week. From CNN, Trump compliments Egyptian president's shoes. From ABC News, Pope to First Lady, what are you feeding Trump? From NBC, Trump pushes Montenegro's prime minister at NATO summit. From the New York Daily News, why the Trump women wore veils in the Vatican but not headscarves in Saudi Arabia. From the Washington Post, the world gets its first real look at the Trump marriage. Plus about 1,000 stories about that weird glass ball thing that Trump touched along with the Saudi king and the Egyptian president. What have we learned? Well, reporters are virtually to a person liberal Democrats, and as a group, they hate Trump the way the devil hates holy water, violently and viscerally. That is bad, as we pointed out before. Their hysteria saps credibility from the news business and makes them look ridiculous, as in this case. They're biased. But bias may not be the worst thing about the press. The worst thing is how shallow and dumb they mostly are, especially on topics that actually matter, like foreign policy. The reason? Well, the business model for many media companies collapsed about 10 years ago. A lot of the adults took early retirement at that point or went into PR. They were replaced by 23-year-old sociology majors raised on social media and blogs. This group doesn't really know anything. Worse, they don't know what they don't know. So they stick to what they do know. Clickbait. Was that a crystal ball Trump touched in Saudi Arabia? Did he hold his wife's hand afterwards? Barf. Who cares? Tell us something that matters. But most of them can't because they're not capable of it. And that is exactly why we called Charles Krauthammer for some facts. He joins us in the studio now. So, Charles, underneath all the hand-holding stories was, I think, a bigger story. What was it?
It was a very big story, and I think it's understood around the world. And I do agree with you. I don't think it's so much anti-Trump animus, although that's big. It's mostly ignorance.
Yeah.
I mean, we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War. You ask any of the reporters in town, any of the people who are the major writers, and you ask them what was the cause of the war, what was the result. People talk about occupied territories. They haven't a clue what that was about. And what you see, therefore, as you point out, is emphasizing the trivialities. But this was a very significant trip, not so much for the actual events of the trip, but for the choices. He chooses to go to Saudi Arabia first. That's never been done. The reason? Because for the last 8 years, we had a policy that can only be called appeasement of Iran. Obama had this idea he was going to change. This can be a Nixon in China. He was going to be the one who would go to the Ayatollah, who would convince Iran we are not their enemy. So what was the first trip Obama did? He goes to Cairo. He says to the Muslim world, I'm new. I'm your friend. We will no longer abuse you and disrespect you. All these apologies. And he thought he'd reap the rewards. What he reaped the rewards of a naif and of a man who did not understand that Iran was unappeasable. So 8 years later, Trump says, no, we've abandoned the Sunni Arabs, who are terrified by Iran, who are threatened by Iran, who are facing an existential threat from Iran. And we're going to reassure them we're on their side. We're not abandoning them. We're not going to tilt to Iran. And by showing up in Riyadh, by giving a speech to 50 Sunni nations, we basically are declaring the U.S. understands the Muslim world right now, the historic importance of what's happening in Muslim is a civil war between Shiite Iran, Persian Shiite Iran, against Arab Sunni nations. That's the war. That explains Iraq, it explains Syria, it explains Lebanon, explains what's going on in Yemen. That's the war, and this United States, having tilted towards the Shiite side, which means aligned with Russia, with Assad, with Hezbollah, with all the bad guys in the region, that's over. We're back where we've always been, on the side of the moderate Arabs, the Gulf Arabs, the Saudis, the Sunnis, and that's the importance of this trip.
So that's exactly what you would do if you were a puppet of Putin, right? Oh, wait, no, it's the opposite. But this, you wrote a piece about this I thought was really smart. You said this is one of the most important things you can do to bring Israel closer to its Arab neighbors.
That's one of the amazing side effects. The Saudis, the Gulf Arabs, the Egyptians, Jordanians, Egyptians and Jordanians already have a peace treaty with Israel. But the rest of the Arab world is stuck in this 70-year habit of hostility to Israel, and they have not been able to move. Now they understand that their enemy is not Israel, it's Iran. Israel has no intent to bring down and eradicate the Saudi regime. Iran does. Iran is an enemy of Israel, it's an enemy of the moderate Arabs, Sunni Arabs. So there is this historic opportunity, and it's happening below the radar. There is cooperation between Saudis and Israelis with intelligence, all this other stuff that we don't hear about. It's an opportunity to soften the eternal hostility between Israel and the Arab states, with the hope, I don't know that it'll be imminent, could take a generation or two, that if you do loosen up those relationships where the Gulf Arabs, the Sunni Arabs, the moderate Arabs, the pro-American Arabs are able to have commerce, interaction, good relations with Israel, that might open up a chance for the Palestinians, who are the key in the end, to say, look, the other Arabs are accommodating with Israel, it's time that we did.
And the other Arabs might pressure them to do that.
They'd get a little, they're getting a bit tired of Palestinian rejectionism, and with Iran breathing down their throats, they know who their friends are and who their enemies are.
That's meaningful, maybe more meaningful than touching a glass ball, just my view. Charles, thanks a lot for explaining that. Well, you didn't really expect Hillary Clinton to go away, did you? Well, she didn't, and today she delivered a commencement address at Wellesley College, where she went. Surprisingly, she gave the address herself rather than sending John Podesta to give it for her. Ooh, sorry, a little election night joke. What she said may be as well as it might be considered a preview for her next run for something. Watch.
We were furious about the past presidential election of a man whose presidency would eventually end in disgrace with his impeachment for obstruction of justice. After firing the person running the investigation into him at the Department of Justice.
Well, of course, the other cable stations love it so much that almost none of them have corrected Hillary Clinton by pointing out that, contrary to her claim, Nixon was never actually impeached for obstruction of justice. Perhaps she confused him with her husband, who was. But that was not her only shot at Trump.
There is a full-fledged assault on truth and reason, drumming up rampant fear about undocumented immigrants, Muslims, minorities, the poor. Some are even denying things we see with our own eyes, like the size of crowds.
Meanwhile, the former candidate also gave an interview to New York Magazine, conducted by fawning abortion activist Rebecca Traister. Whoa, what a puff piece it was. But interesting, throughout the whole thing, Clinton never says word one about her own culpability for losing the campaign. Instead, she spread the blame elsewhere. At one point, she says, quote, "What I was doing was working. I would have won had I not been subjected to the unprecedented attacks by Comey and the Russians, aided and abetted by the suppression of the vote, particularly in Wisconsin. That's right. She didn't visit Wisconsin once during the general election, but her poor showing there was because of voter suppression, the Russians, and Jim Comey, also sexism. She also makes the bold, and by that we mean deranged, claim that, quote, we're up against an even greater domination of the media by the right. Because, you know, you've noticed that recently. Really, the press is dominated by the right. It's unbelievable. They control everything. Are you ready for Hillary to run again? Will she have anyone left to blame by the time that campaign is over? Crystal Ball may know. She's a Democratic strategist and former congressional candidate, and she joins us tonight. Crystal Ball, thanks for coming on. I was sympathetic to Hillary, kind of. I'm always sympathetic to people who lose and are humiliated until I read this piece in New York Magazine, which is like deranged. And in it, she blames, quote, voter suppression for losing a state that she never bothered to visit. I don't know any Democrats who believe that's true. Why would she say something like that?
Well, I think she has definitely been trying to explain her loss, and she says things like, I take responsibility, but then she also does want to shift the blame to things like voter suppression and James Comey and the Russians. So, I mean, I actually agree with you a lot on this, Tucker. I do think that it's possible to say, look, maybe if Jim Comey handles things differently at the end of the campaign, maybe things do go a different way. But ultimately, Donald Trump did not run an amazing campaign. He was not an amazing candidate. He was highly polarizing, and when Election Day came, a majority of Americans were saying he's unfit for the presidency. Hillary Clinton should have been able to win and should have been in a position to win, even with the slings and arrows of Russia and Jim Comey, et cetera. I talk a lot about this, actually, in my book, Reversing the Apocalypse. I think the Democratic Party as a whole has really strayed from their roots as a party of the working class, focused on those economic issues that Trump really did touch on. So, look, I didn't want her to run in the first place. I was a Joe Biden supporter, and then I was a Bernie Sanders supporter. I think there were a lot of problems there, but I also think the problem goes deeper with the Democratic Party if you just look across the country at all the governorships and the state legislative seats and all of that we've lost. I think we've got to do a lot more soul searching than saying Russia and voter suppression.
Yeah, and racial division. I mean, I got to say, though, I was surprised a little bit, even for Hillary, to see just how unwilling she is to come to terms with what happened. And, you know, Trump is often attacked as delusional and he believes things that are demonstrably false, et cetera. Hillary certainly does, based on this interview. I mean, if she believes the things that she says this, for example, I have a lot of sympathy for voters in a lot of places I didn't win because I can see how hard it was. She's saying that because she's spending her time, she says, looking at Google algorithms that show where people search for WikiLeaks. And people who read the WikiLeaks dump were so hoodwinked, she feels sad for them. I mean, that's crazy. The WikiLeaks dump was real. I mean, whatever you think of the dump, like, a normal person wouldn't say something like that. Do you think?
Well, I've never lost a presidential race, so I, like you, have a lot of sympathy. I have lost a congressional race, but I, like you, have a lot of sympathy for what that must be like, and especially when, obviously, she's spent many years preparing, many years thinking about this, 2 bites at the apple, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, to me, the problems with the party go so much further than Hillary Clinton. In a way, she's sort of the symptom of the problems of the party, that we would think she would be the best candidate for this moment. When
I think
people
that's exactly right.
Are looking at the future and saying, when are my wages going to rise? What does the future look like for my kiddos? And so we've got to have people who can speak credibly to that experience and don't have all this baggage of, you know, 6-figure Wall Street speeches and sitting on the board of Walmart and all of those things from her past. We really need new leaders and new faces.
No,
I
think that's an entirely fair point. A healthy party would never have nominated her or allowed itself to be bulldozed by the Clinton cartel. So I want to get back to the Comey thing. The one thing I kind of agreed with in her complaints is that Comey hurt her. I mean, I think that's just true. I'm not saying that for partisan reasons, obviously, but he went and said she'd committed some wrongdoing, but wouldn't specify what it was. I felt it was unfair at the time. And she's mad about it. I get it. But then she's also mad that Trump fired this guy who behaved in an out-of-control way. How can you think Comey was doing things no FBI director ought to do and that he should keep his job? I don't understand it.
Well, he shouldn't have kept his job at the time, and what he did was completely out of bounds and definitely did hurt her. And he has himself expressed that he did not want to put his finger on the scale in a partisan way. But by the time that President Trump decided to fire him, he was then in the middle of investigation. If you were going to get rid of him, then get rid of him right out of the gates. Not when he's already into this investigation, and not after, by the way, that you've said you want his loyalty, and also, by the way, maybe lay off of Michael Flynn.
I mean,
That's
look,
what makes it inappropriate
I half agree with you that the president should have canned him day one. It was obvious to everyone watching there was something weird about Jim Comey. He would get up his high horse and couldn't dismount. But if he's bad for the country in January, he's bad for the country in April and May. So, like, why can't Democrats just celebrate the removal of a crummy FBI director? It seems pretty simple.
I wish it was that simple, Tucker. I really do. But when you're in the middle of an investigation involving the president and his campaign, you can't help but feel that this was an effort to put pressure on the organization, to pressure Jim Comey. There's just a lot of questions around the way that firing happened.
It certainly didn't work, whatever the intent. Crystal, thanks for joining us tonight. I appreciate it.
Always great to see you, Tucker.
Professor in Washington State resisted when activists tried to kick him off campus for his skin color. Now student activists are howling for his job and threatening him. None of this is made up. It actually is happening right now, and the professor has agreed to come on after this break. Also, we'll ask Dirty Jobs host Mike Rowe whether the fight for a $15 minimum wage will help the middle class or usher in a new era of robot hamburger makers. Stay tuned. Time now for campus craziness, and tonight the title is not an overstatement, it really is crazy. Consider Evergreen State College in Washington and Olympia. Every year the school holds a day in absence. In years past, non-white students symbolically left campus and attended anti-racism events. This year, student activists demanded that all white people leave campus or else. Brett Weinstein refused. He's a professor at Evergreen State, and he called the race-based demand, quote, a show of force and an act of oppression. In response to that, here's what happened.
This is not about you.
I'm talking.
This is
all about him.
On terms of white privilege. This is not a discussion. You have lost that one.
You said some racist. Can you apologize? I did not.
Stop telling people of color the useless. You're useless. Get the out.
History could pivot in the direction of the values that you are standing here for.
Yeah, resign.
What?
Resign.
I'm not resigning.
Wow. Professor Brett Weinstein joins us now. Professor, first of all, thank you for coming on. That looks like something, out of Phnom Penh, 1975. Was that, what exactly was going on there? What happened?
Well, what happened is that 50 or so students decided to disrupt the class that I was holding that morning and demand my resignation.
Because you wouldn't leave campus because you're white?
Well, they imagine that I am a racist and that I am teaching racism in the classroom, and that has caused them to imagine that I have no right to speak, that I am harming students by the very act of teaching them.
What happened after the video cut out?
Well, that's an interesting story. The campus police apparently showed up outside of the classroom. The protesters then blocked their entrance. I did not call the police, someone else called the police, and they were concerned for my safety. But when they tried to come into the building to make sure that I was okay, the protesters blocked them. And because the issue of policing is so sensitive at the moment, the police had to run around and find another entrance to the building to get inside and check with me. At the point they did that, the protesters moved on and corralled the president of the college at his office. They extracted some demands from him. Among the demands was that there would be a meeting, well, actually, demands is perhaps the wrong word, a concession, that there would be a meeting at 4 o'clock in a large room on top of our library building. So that meeting took place at the end of the day, and believe it or not, it was far crazier than the video that you just showed.
This whole story is so over the top that even though we do a lot of these, it's hard for me to believe it's real. So the core demand is that all people of your skin color leave the campus. Your president is a guy called George Bridges. Where was he?
Bridges.
Why isn't, there he is right there. George Bridges is supposed to be running this school. Why is he allowing a mob to threaten one of his professors.
Well, I must say, I have some concern that the story is so strange that it's not even going to make sense to an audience that isn't local to the campus. Dr. Bridges is allowing this mob to effectively control the campus, and they have been in control since 9:30 on Tuesday morning. At this moment, I believe Dr. Bridges is answering a set of demands put forward by the protesters, and they have said that if he does not accept their demands, that there will be violence. I do not know what his response to those demands is going to be, but I know that that's taking place at this hour. He has also told the police to stand down. So although the campus police have a sense of what it is that needs to happen in a circumstance like this, they have been hobbled by the fact that they answer to the college administration, and in fact for several days have been barricaded in the campus police station.
Oh my gosh, this is like something out of another country. It's just hard to believe any of this is real. And just our viewers should look this up online, because there are a lot of pieces to the story. It's hard to convey on television, but you had this, I thought, powerful line in your letter, and I assume you're no kind of right-winger. If you teach at Evergreen, I'm sure you're, a Hillary voter, but you had this.
No, not a Hillary voter. I'm a deeply progressive person, and
okay.
I must say
there you go.
I'm troubled by what this implies about the current state of the left.
Well, you think? You said people shouldn't be allowed to speak or not on the basis of their skin color, which seems like a foundational belief of the left, and one that I agree with strongly. And for that, they physically threatened you and are trying to get you fired. This is unbelievable.
They are absolutely trying to get me fired, and they believe that my words in my email are transparently racist. And I think we're caught quite off guard when people who were not at Evergreen read my letter and couldn't find any racism in it.
Well, yeah, just the opposite. Professor, Godspeed to you, and I hope you'll come back with an update on this story, because it's really one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. Thank you.
Thanks, Tucker.
If you found that compelling, next Monday we're putting on a full hour of campus stories, dedicating it to the madness that is consuming our college campuses. Here's a preview of that. You have an absolute right to express your views, period.
You're right.
Do they
no,
not teach?
Right.
Okay, then, and that would include whiteboards, no? I mean, it's kind of simple.
The idea of freedom of speech is essential to our country. That's literally what our country was founded on.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea that you can disagree with somebody and have
so
that conversation,
stand up for it? You're
that's
a
really good.
student.
But I will say, there's...
I'm standing up for the
Tucker,
First
let me
Amendment.
finish here.
If I were to go to a rally and people said, I'm just pulling this out of thin air, pigs in a blanket fry like bacon, about police officers advocating the killing of cops, I mean, you would say that's unacceptable. That should not be allowed. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying a student group wants to have a discussion about police brutality
or
racism.
If they were to use that phrase, pigs in a blanket, fry like bacon.
I'm not interested in the phrase. I'm not going to debate you over this phrase should be allowed or not.
Because you have no principles. That's why. That's coming up Memorial Day at our usual time, 8 p.m. Eastern. Grab a beer. Up next, a Republican congressman thinks the U.S. ought to try to work with Russia in some cases when it helps us. For that, he's being denounced as a Russian spy. Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, victim of McCarthyism, 2017 style, joins us next. If you need to know how the D.C. smear machine works, look no further than the case of California Congressman Dana Rohrabacher. He thinks the U.S. may have more to gain under certain circumstances by cooperating with Russia than by fighting with them. That view may sound familiar since Barack Obama held it just a few years ago, but things have changed dramatically in Washington. Last week, the New York Times targeted Rohrabacher, printing leaks from unnamed officials who said Rohrabacher was warned in 2012 that Russian intelligence was trying to recruit him. Now the left is treating him like a Russian spy. Keep in mind, there's no evidence he did anything wrong. Congressman Dana Rohrabacher of Orange County joins us tonight. Congressman, thanks for coming on.
Hey, Tucker. Good to be with you.
So are you now, or have you ever been, a spy for the Russian government?
No, nor have I ever received any financial support from the Russian government or Russian people, period. That's all baloney.
So the essence of this story is that Russian agents who are not named, according to officials who are not named, were discussing ways to recruit you. Do you think that's true?
That's basically the essence of the story. I had met I'm the chairman now of the committee, the subcommittee in Congress that oversees our relations with Europe, Russia, and Central Asia.
Yes.
And I had been on a congressional delegation to Russia. I'd met a member of the the equivalent of the Russian State Department there. He was later transferred to Washington and went out of his way to remake our acquaintance. Now, that's what the FBI was warning me about, that he might be that he was an intelligence officer. Well, I treat anybody from the Russian embassy, or frankly, any embassy, when I don't know the person, I treat them as an intelligence officer. That's the rational thing to do.
So, the implication of the story, though, is that you were doing something wrong. Now, I guess the obvious question is, that was 5 years ago. Why did it come out now?
Well, this is basically what we're experiencing. Something with no substance in it, and it's being stated in a very sinister way to leave people with the idea that I have done something or President Trump has done something wrong, and we in some way have done something that isn't beneficial for the United States, but is in some way beneficial to Russia. By the way, at the same time, the people leaving that sinister idea, they don't even mention Hillary Clinton and the Clinton Foundation raising millions of dollars from oligarchs in Russia. At the same time, they're selling away America's uranium to those oligarchs.
Right. No, this is if you were to look up McCarthyism, this is exactly what it looks like. This is the definition of it. Do you think the United States, though, as a policy matter, has something to gain from cooperating with Russia under certain circumstances?
Well, that's where I'm actually, I am a lone voice, except for President Trump has the same inclination, and that is we've got to prioritize who our enemy is. In World War II, our enemy was Adolf Hitler and the Japanese militarists, and we needed Joe Stalin, and we worked with him. Well, our primary enemy is no longer the Soviet Union. The Cold War is over, and I fought the Cold War, as you are well aware, and was a player. I was Reagan's staffer, but I did a lot of things in the Cold War to defeat the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union doesn't exist. Our priority enemy now has to be radical Islamic terrorists. If there's a nuclear bomb that goes off in one of our cities, that will be the enemy. We need to cooperate with Russia. They're being murdered just like the rest of our allies to defeat the primary enemy. I get a lot of guff about that because there's this unrelenting hostility towards Russia that would, they're not there. It's an imperfect government there. They are not as good a democracy as our Western European allies, but they should be helping us defeat radical Islam.
So finally, is this having real-world consequences? I mean, McCarthyism by its nature hurts people, makes it harder for them to do the jobs they do. Has this affected your life? I know you're running for re-election. This is an issue in your campaign?
Oh, it is. Well, you have some multimillionaires who are running against me now who will probably put out, and I already have been putting out these hit pieces that are aimed trying to convince people that I've been engaged in some type of illegal act or something. It's the same thing they're doing with Trump. I mean, let's face it. You got all of these sinister implications when there's nothing there. I mean, I've been looking for proof that the Russians had something to do with hacking into the DNC emails, but it's not there. After you hear these people testify, well, Trump is being castigated now, and this is an attempt. And I'm in the same boat with him, but you know what? Trump is doing a good job. He's over there expanding America's influence among people who thought we were pushovers for the last 8 years, and both on the terrorist side, but also on our allied side. So I'm proud to be backing up President Trump in these efforts.
Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, who, by the way, when it actually mattered, was on the right side of the fight against Russia. Thank you for that.
That's right. Thank you.
Mike Rowe, championing the working man, joins us now. Well, 2 days ago, protesters amassed outside a McDonald's shareholder meeting in Chicago. They demanded that the company start paying its roughly 850,000 workers in the United States a $15 minimum wage. Do the protesters really want to get their wish? What would happen if they did? Working at McDonald's is not that complicated. So would a $15 wage drive further automation and lead to mass layoffs? No one really knows, but that's a concern, and we brought it up recently with former Dirty Jobs host Mike Rowe. Here was his view. Mike Rowe, thanks for joining us.
I wouldn't miss it.
So protesters have gathered outside McDonald's across the country demanding higher wages. And so on the one hand, of course, I'm always sympathetic to people who want to get paid more, for sure, especially for jobs that are hard and long. On the other hand, at what point does McDonald's decide we're replacing you with automation, with robots?
Probably this point, or probably soon. I don't have a crystal ball, but I mean, everybody I've talked to is going back and again to the, well, they call it the threat of automation. And like the headlines that I'm seeing are how computers are going to steal our jobs. And I don't really know that it makes sense to anthropomorphize it. I mean, I don't think the computers are, going around like twirling their mustache and laughing maniacally. But it's going to happen. I mean, it's going to happen just as surely as the internet messed up the TV, and the TV messed up cinema, and cinema disrupted radio, and radio messed up the newspapers, and Kindle screwed up the booksellers, and so it goes. But I don't think it's anything to panic over. It's going to happen. But as it relates to the minimum wage conversation, and as it relates to labor and management, the only thing I can add to it is that with my foundation, we try and remind people that learning a skill that's actually in demand negates the whole conversation. If you can weld, if you're a plumber, if you're an electrician, if you're willing to learn a skill that has a pre-existing demand, then you don't have to constantly negotiate and talk about a few extra dollars in order to stay in a position that, frankly, I don't know how you advance in that kind of thinking.
That's right.
Right. So our philosophy is pretty simple. If you have a skill and that skill is in demand, you can work where you want and you can write your own ticket. If you don't, you're going to have to hope the next negotiation works out and the next minimum wage position falls favorably in your direction, which strikes me as fatalistic.
That's such a common sense point.
Oh, I can't help it. I can't help it. I'm just.
But it makes inherent and unassailable sense. So why aren't our schools encouraging some percentage of kids to do the same thing?
As we've discussed before, I think we've got it in our heads that there's a category of good jobs and bad jobs, that there's a category of good education and bad education. We don't call it that. We call it higher education and alternative education. Right. But look, it's fun with the language, right? And the minute you categorize an entire vertical of education as alternative, you might as well call it subordinate. So the message starts early on. If you go to a trade school, you're going to have to settle for a second-class job or some kind of vocational consolation prize. And so parents don't want that for their kids. Guidance counselors don't want that for their schools. So all of these opportunities that today constitute 5.6 million available jobs, open jobs, that are sitting there. They don't get any press and they don't get any love because somewhere back in the reptilian part of our brain, we believe they're substandard. That's dumb.
But they pay well. What I'm confused by is so many young people wind up in what they're calling the sharing economy, where a few billionaires in Silicon Valley exploit them for nothing, basically. So you rent your apartment on Airbnb, drive a car for Uber. These are jobs that pay many times that, right? Or am I missing it?
Well, look, I mean, it's hard. It's tempting to take a cookie-cutter approach to everything.
Of course.
And put every job. What's a news anchor get? Kind of depends. You in Dubuque,
Definitely
Des Moines,
depends, for sure.
Well, same thing with welding. You know, if you got your certificate to weld and you're in Oklahoma, you might start at 45 grand a year. A year later, you might be in western North Dakota making 120 grand, or in the Gulf doing better than that. The skill goes where you go. And this is another thing schools don't teach. If you have a skill that's in demand, it's innate in you. Whatever talent.
It's portable.
Yeah, it's inherently mobile. It's not, you don't have to go to the McDonald's, with respect, right? I mean, you don't have to go to the retailer and stand behind the counter and wait for the business to come. You can, no one talks about the path to small businesses that trades represent. They just don't talk about it. But on my old show, I can't tell you how many people I ran into who had a small business who had employees, who had multiple trucks, but started with a skill. So my thing with the minimum wage and with automation and with all of it is that anything we do that knocks the bottom rungs off of the ladder that we all must surely climb,
yeah, that's for sure,
is self-defeating. So if getting to $15 an hour hastens automation and therefore eliminates thousands of opportunities for kids who, by the way, are not just learning how to flip a burger, but how to tuck their shirt in, of course, how to show up on time. All this basic stuff. I mean, how else do you learn that except by being in your first or second job? We're going to arbitrage logic right out of the equation, and then R2-D2, take a bow. That's not bad.
Add the special side. It's very good. It's very good. And by the way, you're not reading anything. I can just assure our viewers that was.
No, well, I can't read, tragically. And this is something we should talk about in the future.
We should. That's right. Literacy. Mike Rowe, it's always great to see you.
Likewise.
Well, we're told to follow our hearts, and now a woman is doing that by marrying her true love, a train station in San Diego. Could they be the craziest story of the day, or merely somehow just the runner-up? Well, we devote a whole show to weird news, but the weirdest we saved for last. And to sort out the weirdest from the merely weird, our Top That panel. Tonight, joining us, Ashley Pratt, contributor at U.S. News World Report, and Katie Freitz, managing editor at Olympic Media. Okay, you've got some really weird ones tonight, but Ashley, you first.
Oh, wonderful. So there were these two friends that go to Mexico on a trip, and they really liked the tortillas that were served at this burrito restaurant. So they wanted to take the recipe back to Portland, Oregon, which, you know, a very progressive area. You would think they would like Mexican food and like diversity in their food and culture, and apparently not. They then got so much backlash because the two women that owned the restaurant decided to talk about how they met with these two Mexican women when they were there, and they asked them about the recipes and how they made the tortillas that were so buttery and delicious. And people were outraged, and now their burrito truck no longer exists. Social media accounts scrubbed.
Because they appropriated the culture of Mexico in order to make the food.
Because they opened a burrito truck in Portland, Oregon, and that was way too much for Portland, Oregon.
That's deeply offensive.
Yeah,
I'm on their side completely.
Yes, I agree.
Katie, that's pretty bizarre. Can you beat that?
Well, it's sad that they lost out on good burritos.
I agree with that.
But you would assume the heart wants what the heart wants, right? So there's a woman, and her name is Carol. And Carol is deeply, madly in love with a train station.
With the building, the train station building?
Yes, the Santa Fe train station. And she's loved it ever since she was a little girl, and she identifies as objectum sexual.
Okay.
And one psychotherapist says there's about 40 of these people in the world, and she travels 45 minutes by bus every day to meet Deidre, is the name of the train station. She walks around every day and speaks to her, and then leans up against her favorite wall and says she can feel Deidre holding her and kissing her. It's unclear if they've taken it all the way, but the psychotherapist...
let's keep it unclear, shall we?
PG-13,
Let's say the psychotherapist says that these people are frequently desperately lonely.
Okay, so we're laughing at this now because she hasn't moved to D.C. and set up her own lobbying group, at which point it'll be illegal to make fun of this. We'll be fired from our jobs.
Well, and the government hasn't even recognized it, which I think is just unfair to Deidre.
They got to put like millions of dollars behind that study.
I'm sorry to say, that's not even close. Yours is weird, but it's weird in a recognizable way.
That's weird.
Katie, congratulations.
Every train station needs love.
And a consolation trophy to you.
No, but
you were
participation trophy. I'd appreciate more.
Trophy. Thank you both very much.